Right now, we're going to take a deeper look into AI Africa. Now, it's said that 2.5% of the global AI market is represented here in Africa. To dive more into just exactly where we are, I'm joined by Max Cuvellier Giacomelli, Head of Mobile for Development at the GSMA. So, Max, I want to start off. I mean, despite the potential of AI and the fact that we are seeing a $2.9 trillion economy, Africa is representing 2.5%. How does that fare compared to other emerging markets?
Good question. And actually, when we saw the number for the first time, we just thought it compared rather well with the share of global GDP for Africa, which is between 2.5% and 5%, depending on the estimates that you look at. But what really struck us is that it doesn't compare well to the share of population of Africa. Like Africa is somewhere between 15 and 20% of the world's population. It's a share that's growing. And we just thought that behind this great economic potential, there were probably a lot of missed opportunities in terms of direct impact on end users. And this is what we were interested in looking at in our latest report.
Critical factors affecting this disparity?
I think it's probably a lack of visibility of what's happening on the ground. That's one first thing, and this is one thing that we wanted to correct, because through the research that we did, we talked to 100 experts across Africa, in particular in Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. We did identify a lot of use cases in the areas that we were looking at, where we think there's both socioeconomic impact, but also a response to climate change, that are agriculture, energy, and climate action, generally speaking. But obviously, for anything to do with AI, all these use cases are faced with the limitations around three areas in particular. The first one is the availability of the data. The second one is the availability of the compute. And the third one is the availability of skills. And this is all compounding by lack on the financing side, and in some cases, a lack of clear regulation as well.
And this really speaks to infrastructure for a big part, especially when we're talking about the availability of data centers, the high cost of technology. Is this an area where you see potential for private-public partnerships?
Yes, absolutely. And we're seeing some of those already in different areas. I mean, when we look at the compute and the infrastructure side of things, you've got data centers, and there's been a lot that's been said and done recently around data centers in a lot of countries. And what people have to understand is that the cloud, the name is a little bit confusing, because people sometimes feel like it's something hovering over our heads, but it's basically like anchored in physical data centers. And if you don't have physical data centers in your country, in your market, close to your users, that means that the data needs to travel to another part of the world, and that is more expensive, that is not efficient, that is slower in terms of latency. So that's a really big issue. In those areas, we see a lot of public-private partnerships involving governments, private company, also international funders, academia as well. Yeah, that's an example, for instance.
Now, I have to say, I enjoyed perusing through the report, particularly on a sectoral basis, with agriculture showing up as the dominant sector for application for AI. 49% of AI use cases in Africa are within agriculture. What specific AI technologies are currently being used? And I also want to know who's best in class when it comes to countries or regions applying this technology.
Yeah, we were surprised and not surprised at the same time by the importance of agriculture in terms of like AI for good use cases, because at the end of the day, 80% of the food consumed in Africa is produced by African smallholder farmers. And the share of agriculture in terms of the number of people working in that space, but also a share of GDP, is quite important. So it's normal that it's attracting a lot of talent there. And we've seen a full range of AI-powered use cases, whether it's like data-driven agri-advisory for smallholder farmers, but also digital financial services, in particular using AI algorithms to build credit scoring for smallholder farmers. There's obviously a lot of talk around smart farming that is happening, but sometimes not always affordable for smallholder farmers. And I think that two examples in particular that I like to call out, because you're asking me which markets. We're seeing a lot happening in Kenya and Nigeria for different reasons. In Nigeria, it tends to be very much driven by startups. We're actually working with one of them called Crop to Cash in Nigeria that just launched their service, Farm Advice, which basically is an IVR, so interactive voice response, doesn't need even a smartphone on the smallholder farmers side, and can really tailor agri-advisory to them based on their specific situation. And it does that in English, but also in Yoruba and Hausa. And this is one of the very few generative AI use cases that we've seen. On the predictive AI side, there's a lot happening in Kenya in particular, where it tends to be more a mix of players, because Kenya is a bit more active ecosystem in terms of technology for good, if I can say. We work with another organization there called Ujuzi Kilimo that is basically doing remote soil sensors on demand as a service, as I can say. And basically, instead of asking smallholder farmers to invest in a soil sensor, which might be too expensive for most of them, basically they provide that as a service and then run the algorithm on this to go back to the farmers with advice on what to plant, when to plant it, what fertilizers to use, and so on.
And I'm glad that you mention, or make a mention rather, of local languages, because that's one of the things with AI and the, let's say, the application of AI on the African continent that has been a hindrance, or rather a cause for concern. The fact that we have quite an abundance of languages. How do you see that being deployed in terms of your report?
So that's probably the biggest limitation when it comes to data. There is available data to do a lot of predictive AI in particular. So predictive AI is when you're trying to tap into as much information as possible to read into the future, if I can say. It's kind of like to give you a dashboard or recommendation on what might happen. But generative AI, which is much more of a dialogue between the system and the user, is limited today to a handful of very widely spoken languages. There's a lot available in English, for instance, but if you're not speaking one of the core languages, it's far less. So for us, it's really critical to identify opportunities to create those very large data sets that you need to train those large language models, because technically the technology behind it is able to be replicated in any language. The main restriction today is the availability of the data.
But I mean, bringing this data to the forefront is a financial cost. It's an investment. Is there enough being poured into AI from the African continent? And if not, what else can be done to attract further investment?
That's a big question. On the data side, I think we are starting to identify initiatives that could help create those big data sets, actually relying on users themselves, like asking them to record content in their own dialect, with their own accent and so on, that will create enough data to be able to train large language models. But if we look at the question of financing, obviously there are multiple areas that require not only focus, but finance. On the data side, I just mentioned it. On the compute side, there's obviously the servers and that we mentioned earlier, but there's also the availability of supercomputers. There are only 2 installed in Africa at the moment, 1 in South Africa and 1 in Morocco, but also availability in the market of high quality GPUs that are harder to come by in Africa than they are in other geographies. But then also on skills, obviously you need to train the right talent to be able to build those algorithms. But it's also what we're advocating for is multidisciplinary skills, because you just don't need people who can build AI. You need people who can build AI and think, how can that apply to energy? How can that apply to agriculture? So you need to build a lot of depth in terms of the skills that are around AI. And on top of that, obviously, you need enabling regulation across the board. So it's a lot to ask, and it's an ask times 54, because each market will have different needs in terms of infrastructure, but also different regulatory environments.
Exactly. Well, Max, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your insights. That was Max Cuvellier Giacomelli, Head of Mobile for Development at the GSMA.